Welcome back to Human Wreckage, the show where we examine the darkest intersections between human potential and human depravity. I'm your host, Thomas, and today we're stepping into a case that reads like the script of a horror film, except this time, the writer wasn't creating fiction, he was living it. This is the story of Blake Leibel, a man born into wealth, privilege, and opportunity. An aspiring graphic novelist, a Hollywood hopeful, a socialite, a father, and in the end, a convicted murderer whose crime would stun even seasoned investigators. The case is shocking not just for its brutality, but for how eerily it mirrors the works of fiction Blake himself once created. This episode contains themes of violence, psychological abuse, and murder. Listener discretion is advised. Let's begin. Blake Leibel was born in 1981 into a family that, from the outside, looked like a model of Canadian success. His father, Lorne Leibel, was not just wealthy, he was a power figure, a real estate developer, a builder of luxury homes, and an Olympic sailor. His mother, Sandy, was equally ambitious, active in Toronto's philanthropic community. Blake grew up in a world shaped by influence, comfort, and image, a world where resources were never lacking. But luxury doesn't guarantee stability. Those close to Blake would later describe an upbringing marked by emotional distance and heightened expectations. He was the younger of two sons, overshadowed at times by his older brother Cody, who followed a more traditional path in the family business. Blake, however, gravitated toward storytelling, toward the strange, the graphic, the gothic. He loved comics, movies, and immersive fictional worlds. It wasn't long before he decided that he wanted to build these worlds himself. In the early 2000s, he left Toronto for Los Angeles, a city that thrives on dreams, whether or not they ever come true. Los Angeles suited Blake, at least at first. He dressed the part of a creative wanderer. Designer clothes, messy hair, the air of someone who always had a story simmering beneath the surface. He had the money to live comfortably, but he sought something else: validation. He wanted to be taken seriously in the entertainment world. And for a while, it seemed like he might actually get there. He worked on an animated series called Spaceballs. The animated series, loosely tied to Mel Brooks' cult classic. He also co-created a graphic novel titled Syndrome with Daniel Quantz and R.J. Ryan, illustrated by David Marquez, who would later gain major recognition at Marvel. Syndrome was conceptually striking, a dark story exploring the roots of evil, the psychology of violence, and the possibility of controlling human behavior. One of its central themes: that human cruelty could be studied, manipulated, even orchestrated with clinical precision. At the time, no one imagined how disturbingly close the parallels would become. But even as Blake pursued creative work, his personal life was unraveling. In Los Angeles, Blake met and married a woman named Amanda Braun. They had one child together, a boy, but the relationship didn't last. Friends described Blake as controlling, jealous, and prone to unpredictable emotions. Others said he struggled with insecurity, especially when his creative ambitions stalled. By 2015, the marriage had deteriorated beyond repair. Blake moved out, though he continued to support Amanda financially. That same year, Blake's life was hit by another blow, one far more devastating. His mother, Sandy, passed away from brain cancer. According to court documents later revealed, Blake was the executor of her estate, and he stood to inherit a considerable portion of the family's wealth. But instead of grounding him, this influx seemed to destabilize him further. He withdrew from friends. He began acting erratically. He isolated himself. And then, in 2015, he met a woman who brought light into his chaotic world, at least for a time. Her name was Yana Kazhin. Yana Kazhin was born in Kyiv, Ukraine. She worked as an attorney before moving to the U.S. in search of a quieter, safer life. Those who knew her described her as kind, soft-spoken, and determined. She was small in stature, but strong in presence. She met Blake in 2015, and for a while, they appeared happy. Blake seemed gentler with her, protective, maybe even hopeful again. The two eventually moved into a West Hollywood apartment together. It wasn't a palace, especially compared to the luxury Blake grew up in, but it was theirs. In May of 2016, they welcomed a daughter. By all accounts, Yana was thrilled to be a mother. Friends said she was glowing in the days after the birth. Yet behind closed doors, something was wrong. Very wrong. About a week after Yana gave birth, Blake's behavior shifted drastically. His mother's death had thrown him into a spiraling depression, and he'd grown increasingly paranoid. Amanda Braun, his estranged wife, later testified that Blake had developed delusions, believing that people were conspiring against him. Police were called at least once after a dispute between Blake and Amanda over custody issues, but nothing at the time indicated the violence that was looming. What we do know is this. On May 23, 2016, Blake checked himself into the couple's apartment and refused to come out. He barricaded the door from the inside. He kept Yana with him. Her family grew worried when she stopped answering texts, then calls. The last person to hear from Yana was her mother, who lived nearby. She said Yana sounded anxious, afraid, but didn't give details. The next day, May 24th, was the last day anyone would see Yana alive. On May 25th, 2016, something happened that finally brought law enforcement to the apartment. Amanda Braun, Blake's estranged wife, called the police. She told them Blake had taken their infant son the day before and hadn't returned him. She was worried for the child's safety. She knew Blake had been acting erratically. She also mentioned that Yana had recently given birth and was believed to be inside. Deputies from the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department arrived at the West Hollywood apartment. They knocked. No answer. They heard movement inside. They knocked again, harder. A few minutes later, Blake finally opened the door just a crack. He looked disheveled, pale, expressionless. Officers later reported that he had a blank stare, as though he were somewhere else entirely. Behind him, the apartment was in shambles, clothes strewn everywhere, bedding piled up, a strange silence hanging in the air. Deputies asked where Yana was. Blake didn't answer. They pushed inside. What they found would stay with them for the rest of their careers. In the bedroom, on the bed, lay the body of Yana Kazan. She had been murdered in a manner so horrific that seasoned homicide detectives later called it one of the most disturbing crime scenes they had ever encountered. While I will not recount the more graphic physical injuries, the essential facts are these. Yana had been brutally assaulted over many hours. The attack was methodical, not impulsive. She had fought for her life, and she had died slowly. Her newborn daughter, miraculously, was unharmed and in another room. Blake said almost nothing as officers handcuffed him, almost as if he were detached from the reality of what had happened. But reality was coming for him. Detectives began piecing together the timeline. They learned that Blake had isolated Yana in the apartment for hours before her death. Evidence suggested she had been tortured over an extended period. Prosecutors pointed to a chilling detail: similarities between Yana's injuries and scenes depicted in Blake's graphic novel Syndrome. In the novel, there were depictions of bodies manipulated and experimented on, a fictional exploration into the nature of evil. The prosecutor argued that Blake may have used his own work as a blueprint. This wasn't a spontaneous act of rage, they said. It was a deliberate, controlled, slow descent into violence. Detectives also discovered that Blake had drained large sums of money from his mother's estate during the weeks leading up to the murder. He was spending erratically, acting irrationally, and becoming increasingly volatile. His mental state was unraveling, and Yana paid the ultimate price. Blake Leibel stood trial in 2018. His appearance was strikingly different from the confident Hollywood hopeful he once was. He looked tired, heavy, withdrawn. Throughout the trial, he spoke little. His defense team attempted to paint a picture of mental instability, of a man who was overwhelmed by grief, stress, and delusion. But mental deterioration does not automatically equate to legal insanity, and the prosecution came prepared. They laid out the timeline. They highlighted the deliberate nature of the injuries. They showed the jury passages from Syndrome, drawing connections that made the courtroom shift uncomfortably in their seats. They presented evidence that Yana had been alive for much of the ordeal. That Blake had opportunities, many opportunities to stop, but he didn't. Witnesses testified that Blake had a history of controlling behavior, especially in relationships, that he became possessive, that he feared abandonment. Prosecutors argued that the days after his daughter's birth, when attention shifted from Blake to the new child, triggered a catastrophic unraveling. The jury deliberated for just 4 hours. They found Blake Leibel guilty of first-degree murder as well as torture and aggravated mayhem. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. When cases like this hit the public eye, we often struggle to understand them. How does someone born into privilege commit such an incomprehensible act? How does creativity curdle into violence? What happens in the space between imagination and action? Some argue that Blake's upbringing, while wealthy, may have lacked emotional stability. Others point to his mother's death as a significant psychological blow, and others still consider his creative ambitions, which, despite early promise, had stalled in adulthood. Perhaps he felt he was fading, losing control, losing relevance. But explanations are not justifications. Blake was not impoverished. He was not without support. He had access to mental health care, financial resources, and a family network. He had the means to build a stable life. So why didn't he? Was it narcissism? Delusion? A deep-seated need for power? Or was it something simpler and more disturbing? A willingness to turn fiction into reality. A willingness to destroy another human being. A willingness to let darkness take the wheel and never look back. While Blake sits in prison, one life continues, one life untouched by her mother's presence, yet shaped forever by her absence. Yana's daughter survived the ordeal physically, but emotionally, her story is only beginning. She is being raised by Yana's family, away from the shadow of her father. Her existence is a testament to resilience. Proof that even in the darkest stories, there can be a flicker of hope. Yana's life, her strength, her kindness, her journey deserves more attention than the violent way it ended. She came to the United States for safety, for opportunity, for peace. Instead, she encountered a man who presented himself as gentle, artistic, unconventional, a man she believed she could trust. We often speak of victims only in relation to their perpetrators, but Yana was more than Blake's victim. She was a daughter, a mother, a friend. She was a woman beginning a new chapter, only to have it ripped away in its first pages. Her story matters. Her memory matters. And remembering her means refusing to allow Blake's violence to define her existence. There is an uncomfortable relationship between horror fiction and real-world violence. Some fear that dark stories inspire dark acts, but most people who watch or create horror will never harm another person. So what made Blake different? It's possible that fiction didn't drive him to violence, but instead provided a framework for something already inside him. Something latent. Something that needed only the right moment, the right pressure to emerge. In Syndrome, Blake and his co-creators explored what happens when human empathy can be turned off, when cruelty becomes clinical, detached, almost scientific. It was a story about manipulating human behavior, about controlling the uncontrollable. And that's what the prosecution argued Blake tried to do. Control another human being completely, stripping away her autonomy, her dignity, and eventually her life. Whether or not Blake consciously modeled his actions on his work, the thematic parallel stands as a haunting warning. Sometimes the monsters we create on paper are easier to confront than the ones we carry within. People often assume that wealth insulates against violence, that privilege prevents desperation, that opportunity saves people from their worst impulses. But privilege doesn't guarantee morality. Money can mask dysfunction. It can disguise instability. It can grant time, privacy, and freedom to explore unhealthy fantasies unchecked. Privilege can also give someone the confidence to believe they're untouchable. In Blake's case, it may have done all three. He had the resources to isolate himself from accountability. He had the luxury of pursuing creative fantasies without practical constraints, and he may have believed that his status alone could shield him from consequences. But the truth is this: violence does not discriminate based on class. Monsters are not made exclusively by poverty, trauma, or hardship. Sometimes they are born from entitlement, narcissism, or an inability to accept one's own insignificance. The murder of Yana Kazan forces us to confront some uncomfortable truths. That danger can come from people who seem charming, talented, and affluent. That violence can emerge gradually, subtly, behind closed doors. That manipulation often precedes catastrophe. One of the most tragic parts of this case is how preventable it may have been if Blake had received help earlier, if those around him had recognized the warning signs, if Yana's fear in her final days had been taken seriously. But hindsight is a cruel teacher. We look back and see the pattern clearly, even when those living through it could not. What we can do now, what we must do, is carry forward the lessons. The importance of believing victims. The importance of recognizing the signs of coercive control. The importance of intervening, even when it feels uncomfortable. Because violence thrives in silence. and Yana's voice was silenced long before her life was taken. Blake Leibel had every opportunity in life. Yana Kazan asked for so little safety, love, a chance to raise her daughter. Their story reminds us that evil doesn't always come from the shadows. Sometimes it comes from the penthouse, from the studio lot, from the places we least expect. As always, Yana the victim, not the perpetrator. Yana, your story is remembered here. If you or someone you know is experiencing domestic abuse or controlling behavior, please reach out to a friend, to a hotline, to anyone. There is help, there is hope, and you are not alone. Thank you for listening to Human Wreckage. Stay safe, stay aware, and remember, even in the darkest truths, there is power in knowing.